This episode is brought to you by Summit Ministries, and I love what one mom had to say about Summit. She said this: "I'm not capable of teaching my kids all the things they learn at Summit. I homeschool them and we read many great books together, but nothing compares to what they've internalized after attending Summit." The one thing I tell fellow moms they must do is send your kids to Summit. So if you have a child between the ages of 16 and 22, send them on a 2-week conference in Georgia or Colorado this summer. You can learn more at summit.org/Alisa, and you're going to lock in your early bird rate when you register before March 31st. And they are offering a great discount of $200 if you use my code Alisa24. So go to summit.org/Alisa, use my code Alisa24. Again, that's summit.org/Alisa, use my code Alisa24. Welcome to the Alisa Childers Podcast, where we equip Christians to identify the core beliefs of historic Christianity, discern its counterfeits, and proclaim the gospel with clarity, kindness, and truth. And I've just had a fascinating conversation with Dr. Stephen Meyer. We do not talk a lot about science on this podcast, but the few times that we have, those episodes have been very popular, and I suspect that this one will be no different. This was such a fascinating conversation. Some highlights for me was when Dr. Meyer talked about the relationship between philosophy and science. We talked about the pre-commitment of many atheist scientists to this worldview of materialism, which is the idea that the only thing that exists is the material world. It's matter and its movements and its modifications, and how even some intellectually honest atheists will actually admit that. We read a very shocking quote from an atheist about just admitting basically we don't want to allow there to be any kind of a supernatural realm, so we have to keep it in this materialism box. That was a really fascinating part of the conversation. One of the parts that was really clarifying for me was when Dr. Meyer defined evolution. And really, there's kind of 3 different things people are talking about when they talk about evolution. We talked about his realm of study, which is intelligent design, which is the science of discovering the cause of things and assigning a causal, he said it a lot better than this because I'm not a scientist, but talking about the cause of things and how we look out into creation and we see that something caused these things because there's evidence for it. And so we talked about some of that evidence. We talked a little bit about the Big Bang. We talked about the fossil record and what that has to play into the understanding of science and evolution and how that might play into intelligent design. Fascinating conversation. So I hope you get a lot out of this. I hope it's edifying for you. And I definitely want to encourage you to pick up his newest book called Return of the God Hypothesis. This is Dr. Stephen Meyer. Well, Dr. Meyer, I have wanted to have you on the podcast for a really long time, so it's such a joy to have you. I would love for you to just introduce yourself to my audience and let us know your story. Were you raised in a Christian home, or how did you come to faith? And then ultimately, what led you to study science and talk about the intersection of faith and science?
Wow, that's a big opening question. I, I First of all, I live in Seattle. I direct a program called the Center for Science and Culture at the Discovery Institute. We have a network of scientists and scholars who are challenging what we call, or what scholars call, scientific materialism, a worldview that suggests that science, properly understood, supports the idea of a self-existent, self-organizing, self-creating universe, often also associated with atheism, the new atheism, scientific atheism, sometimes it's called, represented by figures like Richard Dawkins and Lawrence Krauss. So we're challenging that on scientific grounds. We think that the scientific evidence doesn't point to um, a an unguided, undirected creation of the universe, or to, as Richard Dawkins says, blind, pitiless indifference, a universe in which there's no purpose, but rather it points to the reality of a designing intelligence, and indeed a transcendent intelligence that, for example, Jews and Christians have long associated with God. So we are supporting a broadly theistic understanding of nature, going back to the understanding of the early founders of modern science, people like uh, Johannes Kepler and Robert Boyle and Sir Isaac Newton. So that's sort of the focus of our work. My own story started, I guess, as far as thinking about the big questions as a teenager. I was convalescing from a bad skiing accident, and I started having these recurring, I guess now I'd call them existential questions about what about the meaning of life. What was anything that I could do? What I had that one question that kept recurring was, what's anything going to matter in 100 years? I couldn't imagine any human activity that would have a lasting or enduring value. I was at the time I was reading this history of baseball, and I loved baseball, and yet all the stories seemed to end the same. The recruit would come up, be scouted in the minor leagues, come up, have a major league career, accumulate various records, but in the mid 30s to 40, early, by maybe 40 at the latest, the career would be over. The famous baseball player would enjoy the benefits of having had a earlier life of celebrity, but then so what? It's at the end a bunch of numbers on a piece of paper, and then I began to think, well, what does anything matter really? If you save a life, then well, that person lives, but eventually they die, and so what's the point of all this? Was kind of,
Yeah.
and I couldn't really answer the question, and it frightened me. And one day I thought, I wonder if this is what it means to be insane. And then
Mm.
I kind of had almost a panic attack, thinking that maybe I am insane. Maybe I'm insane because I can't answer these. I don't know where these questions are coming from. I don't. I had questions about time. It seemed very mysterious to me that you could have an event that I could easily remember, but it was gone and past, and so I could drop a ball and then realize, well, now that event is already gone, and now I'm into a next event, but now that one is gone, and so it seemed like there had to be something that didn't change, or everything that was constantly changing had no enduring meaning or purpose or lasting significance.
Mm.
And was eventually, um, while I was in this kind of funk, I picked up the big fat white Catholic family Bible that we never read, and I opened it, and it fell open to the division between the two testaments, and there was a picture of a very uh, manly carpenter figure, Jesus, and started to read it. And the verse under at the bottom said, "Come unto me, all ye who labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest." And I thought that sounded pretty intriguing, and so I started to read at the beginning of the Gospel of Matthew, and I found um, I was when this as I started to read, it was um, I found I needed to read at least one chapter a night before bed because it settled something
Mm.
in me. And
Yeah.
I eventually, as I read more, found that there were things in the Bible that actually address these, what I later learned were essentially philosophical questions, and that there was a worldview implicit in the Bible that answered those existential questions. The Bible spoke of eternal life and of someone that didn't change. The great passage in the Exodus, that when Moses encountered God at the burning bush, the name that God gave him was the I am that I am, the eternal, self-existent one. And the New Testament revealed Jesus as someone who is the same today, yesterday, and forever. And so, little by little, whereas I knew some kids at school in high school who were having these ecstatic conversion experiences. What happened for me is I started to feel normal for the first time. I started to
Oh.
have structures for my mind that bound all these racing thoughts and gave me perspective on them. So when I got to college, and I had always been interested in science stuff as a little kid. I was keen on dinosaurs and things like that. But when I got to college, I was majoring in physics and geology. But I would uh, get across campus once a semester and sign up for a philosophy class from a particular professor named Norman Krebs, who was uh, ended up being a life mentor for me, and he was teaching courses on Francis Schaeffer's books and on Os Guinness's books, as well as standard philosophy stuff. And I remember in a January term, we were uh, studying the book "He Is There and Not Silent" by Francis Schaeffer, who had paraphrased a great dictum from Jean-Paul Sartre, the atheistic existentialist, who said that without an infinite reference point, nothing finite has any meaning or enduring value. And I thought, that's it. That's
That's
what
it.
was bothering
Yeah.
me.
Yeah.
And I remember telling my professor, well, I wasn't insane. I was just a philosopher. And he laughed and he said, well, you must keep in mind, though, that there's a fine line between insanity and philosophy. So, in any case, um, so there was a fairly long, protracted period where I was thinking about Christianity all the time, but wasn't sure that I was a Christian. And it was really not till I got out of the 4 years of undergraduate university that I kind of settled and realized, no, I really believe. And at that point, I got a kind of a new energy and wanted not just to contemplate, but to do and to
Yeah.
serve. And a couple of years later, I encountered some of the scientists who were first working on this idea of intelligent design, and that ignited some real interest in me. So
I love that. And intelligent design is something that I think a lot of people don't really understand. It's not exactly the same thing as what we might call creation science or creationism. I mean, it's actually if I'm getting this correctly, and correct me if I'm wrong, because science is not my strong suit. I will be totally honest with you.
well,
However, when
I
I
come
was
from a family of musicians. I'm the only one in our
okay,
family that lacks musical talent. So
there you go.
we're on equal footing, Alyssa.
Yes. Well, but I did find when I was in my faith crisis, my personal faith crisis, that listening to lectures on intelligent design, and I think I even read one of your books and listened to a bunch of your material, it was so helpful to understand that the difference between maybe, teaching kids that God created the earth. What's the difference? Maybe help our audience understand that. What's the
Yeah, sure.
difference between that and what you're talking about when you say intelligent design?
Well, yeah, for many people in a Christian audience, they'll be familiar with the idea of creationism. And intelligent design and creationism are distinct in two different ways. Uh, Creationism is based on a particular reading of the biblical text, especially the Genesis 1, early Genesis chapters. And there are a couple different forms of creationism. One is sometimes called young earth creationism. That's the form where people affirm that the earth is very young, that the days of creation are uh, correspond to 24-hour Earth days, and so therefore the entire scope of creation is maybe somewhere between 6 and 10,000 years. There are other forms of creationism that interpret those days of Genesis differently as periods of God's creative activity, and they are thought to be of indeterminate length from a human point of view, and that's sometimes called old earth creationism. But both of the forms of creationism are essentially attempts to interpret the Genesis text and use that to inform our understanding of the physical world around us. To say, look, there's this sequence of creation, and and then there's been, as you probably know, some rather spirited debates, sometimes unproductive, between the young Earth and the old Earth people over the age of the Earth.
Yeah.
So intelligent design is different in the sense that it's an age neutral theory. It's not committed to either view. I would say most proponents of intelligent design hold to an old Earth view, but there are some that hold to a young Earth view. And in fact, all young Earth creationists also necessarily uh, affirm there is evidence of intelligent design in the universe. So in any case, we're not the theory of intelligent design is not based on the biblical text. Rather, it's an inference from biological and physical evidence from the world of science. So it's not starting from the biblical text and making a deduction about what must be the case about the physical world around us. Rather, it's starting with an observation of the physical world and then inferring as to what best explains what we see. And we're mainly concerned with a key question that was raised by Charles Darwin himself and by the Darwinian scientists. And that is the question of whether or not the appearance of design in nature that all biologists recognize is real or illusory. Is it real or merely apparent? So Richard Dawkins has famously said that the biology is the study of complicated things that give the appearance of having been designed for a purpose. But for him and for uh, Darwinian biologists, the key word there is appearance. For them, living systems look as though they were designed, but that appearance is an illusion because there's an unguided, undirected process called natural selection acting on random variations and mutations, which produces the appearance of design without that process itself being guided or directed in any way, so that the appearance is false. It's an illusion,
Mm.
um, because an unguided process did the work of creation. So that's what we proponents of intelligent design, that's the proposition we have mainly been challenging. We're not concerned so much about the question of the age or how long ago the design took place, although most of us have opinions about that. but rather we're concerned about this crucial question of whether there is merely apparent design or real design in nature. And we're arguing for the latter case, that there's evidence of real design. So we're different from creationism in two ways. We're not committed to the idea that the earth is very young, um, or necessarily that it's very old for that matter, though that's my view. Um, and uh, our approach is evidence based rather than an inference from biological evidence rather than a deduction from scriptural authority.
And correct me if I'm wrong, but also doesn't intelligent design not really speculate on what the cause actually is? So you're not saying like you're trying to prove the Christian God per se.
Well, no, I think we are definitely making a causal attribution. We're inferring to an intelligent cause rather than to a strictly materialistic cause or process, because we're seeing evidence in the natural world of the distinctive activity of intelligence. We know from our uniform and repeated experience, which is the basis of all scientific reasoning, that information, especially information in a digital form, always arises from an intelligent source. So when the
Yeah.
scientists, Watson and Crick in particular, discovered that the DNA contains not just chemical subunits, but subunits of chemical bits that are arranged in a particular way to convey information, they discovered something that we think is very significant. That it's Bill Gates has said that DNA is like a software program, but
Yeah.
much more complex than any we've ever created. And we know from our experience that software always arises from a mind, not an undirected process. So we're seeing many indicators. And this is, if we go back to your question about intelligent design, we can define intelligent design as the idea that there are certain features in the natural world that are best explained by the activity of a designing intelligence rather than an undirected process like mutation and natural selection. And one of those features is the digital information that's stored in the DNA molecule that
Yeah.
upon which all of life is depends. So we're seeing these distinctive hallmarks. We also see miniature machines and circuits in cells or animals. We're seeing the physicists are telling us about the fine tuning of the universe and the fine tuning of the laws of the constants of physics and the initial conditions of the universe. So all of these things are indicators of the activity of intelligence based on our uniform and repeated experience. If we see a finely tuned system, whether it's a French recipe or an internal combustion engine or an electronic circuit, well, we know that things that have that property that physicists call finely tuned, or fine tuning, that those things always arise from an intelligence. Information always arises from an intelligence in our experience, and that's the basis of scientific reasoning. What do we see? Nature. What is the cause and effect structure of the world that we see around us? The natural world that we know from our experience only minds produce, only intelligent agents produce.
Yeah.
So there's a famous British scientist. His name is James Clerk Maxwell, one of the great physicists, and he said that the inference to design is based on an application of the rules of thought to the perceptions of sense. So if we look at the world around us, we see certain things. We see circuits in cells. We see miniature machines in cells. We see digital code in cells. In our experience, we know that there's only one cause of that type of phenomena, and it's a mind. It's an
Mm.
intelligence. So that's part of it's one of the rules of thought that we can infer by looking, that we've deduced by looking at the way the world works. Then when we see that in the cell you have these features that we know only minds produce, then it makes sense to infer that a mind produced them.
Right.
That's the kind of logic that's involved.
The vast majority of people who buy meat in the grocery store are unaware that that meat is coming from overseas, from countries that don't necessarily have the highest quality standards or transparency. And did you know that here in the US, mRNA vaccines are approved and in use for pigs? So the mystery just continues to grow surrounding the meat that we're buying from the grocery store. And this is one of the reasons I am so grateful for Good Ranchers. In fact, almost all of the meat that my family eats comes from Good Ranchers. I love the heritage breed pork. I love the better than organic chicken. I love that there's no hormones or antibiotics. And Good Ranchers has taken a strong stand against the mRNA vaccine. And in fact, they have pledged to make sure that their meat never contains animals that have been given this vaccine. So this is their say mRNO to mRNA sale, and Good Ranchers is offering an amazing deal for you in the month of March. You're going to get a free 10-pound Easter ham with any subscription. This is a $119 value, and their ham is absolutely fantastic. It's not like the ham and the pork that you buy in the grocery store, and it's guaranteed to be free from mRNA vaccines. So during this sale, every subscription is going to get $25 off any box, a free $119 Heritage ham, and the Good Ranchers lifetime quality commitment, their promise to never compromise on quality. Plus, with their Never mRNO pledge, you can be sure that you're getting meat that's free from any unknown or even potentially harmful additives every single month. And I love that Good Ranchers has such a commitment to this kind of transparency. They believe that you have the right to know exactly what's in your food, and they're not afraid to show you. And so they're amazing supporters of this show. So go support them and the stand that they're taking. No one else is being as loud about this. No one else is taking the stand that they're taking because they want to provide you with the best meat in America, and they're doing a terrific job at it. So go to goodranchers.com and use my code Alisa to get your free Easter ham today. Again, that's goodranchers.com. Use my code Alisa to say mRNO to mRNA. Good Ranchers, American meat delivered. It blows my mind when people will take into account the mini machines that you see that you were talking about, and even the fine tuning of all of the structure of DNA and all the information contained in there, and yet deny that there is an intelligent mind behind that. And yet we recognize that on such a simpler level in our everyday lives. And here's an example. I was at the beach with my kids, and we were on this beach that we had rented kayaks. So it was kind of a private beach that no other people were on that beach. And we parked our kayaks. If parking is what you do with kayaks, I don't know, we docked them or whatever. And we went on the beach, and we saw that there were about 4 or 5 stacks of 5 rocks. So 5 rocks stacked up on top of one another, and about 5 of those stacks. And everybody in our party immediately recognized, oh, somebody did that. Somebody was
Yep,
here
right,
before us, and they stacked those rocks. And you think about how rudimentary that is compared to what's in DNA.
right.
And I'm wonder if do you think that with many scientists, they have this maybe like a pre-commitment to the worldview of materialism, where they're
Oh,
sort of
definitely. Yeah,
presuming that to be true?
right. And let me just unpack the reasoning that you all
Yeah.
employed there at the beach. Um, the way the philosophers would talk about it, they would say that, well, you inferred that this was the product of an intelligence because we know that intelligent agents can do that. They can balance the rocks in a very particular way. And based on our experience, we know that wave action lacks the causal power to do that.
Mm.
Waves would scatter the rocks in lots of different ways. They wouldn't very precisely stack them, getting them to balance just right to make the little pile. So your inference is based on it's well grounded. It's based on your experience, your uniform and repeated experience of what wave action can do and other natural processes can do versus what is known that intelligent agents can do. And so we could extend the analogy a bit further. What if you encountered a message written in the sand, "John loves Mary" or something? Well, you'd infer that probably John wrote that, but certainly an agent did. That the production of information is uniquely the province of intelligent agents. One of the early scientists who was applying informational analysis, what's called information theory and related fields, to the analysis of DNA, said that the creation of new information is habitually associated with conscious activity. And so the discovery of information in the DNA molecule um, is a decisive indicator of prior intelligent activity. This is what we know only minds can do. Now, to make that argument very rigorous and persuasive, you need to look at all the other naturalistic models and proposed causes or processes that scientists have considered. But that's why my books end up being so fat. I wrote one called Signature in the Cell, which was about 500 pages, and I looked at all the different materialistic attempts that had been made to explain the origin of the information necessary to build the first life. And invariably, they failed for different reasons. Some were based on chance processes, some were based on what are called natural laws, some tried to combine the two in a kind of quasi Darwinian way. But there were very good empirical and theoretical reasons in each case um, why undirected material processes are not a sufficient explanation for the origin of information. And yet, I argued, we do know of a cause that is sufficient to produce information. That's intelligence. So, not your wave action, not wind and erosion, not chemical, in this case, the various kinds of chemical reactions, but rather we do know of a cause, and that, again, is mind. And so, why would we not consider that? You've put your finger on it exactly. That since the late 19th century, a convention arose in the natural sciences. This was not a convention that was in force at the time of Newton and Boyle and Kepler when modern science got going. They made design arguments in their scientific work, but it's a convention that began to gain a foothold in the late 19th century, and it's called methodological naturalism. That's a mouthful, but all it means is if you're going to be a scientist, you have to limit yourself to explaining to positing explanations um, in terms of natural causes. You can only posit undirected material processes or natural causes to explain everything, even the origin of life and the origin of the universe and the the phenomenon of consciousness. So we end up having a worldview that eliminates the possibility of minds playing a role in anything as a matter of doing our scientific practice. So when we come across things that seem to scream the activity of mind, we say, well, it can't be that. It's got to be something else. It's got to be some one. It's got to be one or the other of the various types of materialistic processes. There are some based on chance, randomness. There's some based on regularities, natural laws. There's some that combine the two. It's got to be one of those things. So, but it can't be an intelligence that played a role.
Right.
But that rule is followed selectively. If
Yeah.
you walk into the British Museum, you'll see in the great um, stone with the three different languages etched on it, the Rosetta Stone. When the archaeologists discovered that, they didn't say, well, this was wind and erosion.
Right.
As soon as they realized that it was the same message in three different languages, they said, well, there was obviously an ancient scribe. This was the product of intelligence. So we know that information always arises from an intelligence. But if we encounter it in the natural world, and it's pointing to an intelligence beyond our own, then that naturalistic worldview kicks in and people get very reluctant, very uneasy. They say, well, we can't go there. We can't um, follow that evidence to where it most naturally leads, because that would take us to something that our worldview has denied from the outset as a possibility,
And
namely a transcendent intelligence, aka
right.
God. Yeah.
And some atheists are intellectually honest enough to even admit this. And you quote one in your book, Return of the God Hypothesis. This is one of my favorite quotes. This is from Richard Lewontin, who is a retired Harvard evolutionary biologist. And in the New York Times, in the New York Review of Books in 1997, and this is from your book where you quote him, this is what he says. And I'd love for you to unpack this for us and maybe talk about the relationship between philosophy and science. He said this: our willingness to accept scientific claims that are against common sense is the key to an understanding of the real struggle between science and the supernatural. We take the side of science in spite of the patent absurdity of some of its constructs, in spite of the tolerance of the scientific community for unsubstantiated just so stories, because we have a prior commitment, a commitment to materialism. Moreover, that materialism is absolute, and here's the big reveal, for we cannot allow a divine foot in the door.
Yeah, that's it. And notice the way he equates science with a materialistic philosophy, and that's an equation or an equivalence that has really only existed since the late 19th century. It came in partly with the origin of species. Darwin subtly um, uh, enjoined his fellow scientists to limit themselves to strictly materialistic explanations for everything, including some of the biological phenomena that he knew full well could be explained from a design framework, because the biologists just before him, people like Louis Agassiz, who was still alive, Richard Owen, some of the great biologists of the 19th century, were operating out of a design framework. They explained the similarities of in the structure of limbs, for example, or as a result of a common design plan rather than common ancestry. So there were very good alternative explanations for some of the phenomena that he looked at, but he effectively ruled them out of court and said, no, but that's not, in fact, he actually said, that's not a scientific explanation to talk about a designing intelligence having played a role. So that's where and you're right, that is a way in which a particular philosophy is informing the rules of science. It's actually determining the rules of science, but in the process, it's limiting the intellectual freedom of the scientist.
Hmm.
Imagine the archaeologist discovering the Rosetta Stone and saying, "Well, I'd like to say a scribe was involved, but I've got to say it was wind and erosion because that's all that's allowed." Well, that's absurd because we know that wind and erosion doesn't do that. It doesn't generate information-rich inscriptions. It generates more random scratchings, perhaps. And we do know that intelligent scribes do produce information. So we're going against, but the methodological naturalism, if applied consistently, would cause us to overlook obvious evidence of the activity of an intelligence. And that's so part of what we're doing is not only making an evidential argument for intelligent design, we're actually challenging the rules of science as they have been observed since the late 19th century by many, though not all scientists, and saying, hey, the job of the scientist is to follow the evidence where it most naturally leads based on our experience of the cause and effect structure of the world. It is not to infer the best explanation among a limited set that are allowed by materialistic philosophy, but rather to infer the best explanation, full stop, based
Hmm.
on our experience of the way the world works.
Did you know that at 7 weeks, the baby in the womb is the size of a coffee bean? And at 7 weeks, the heartbeat is detectable. And this is why 7 Weeks Coffee chose their name 7 Weeks, because they are unapologetically pro-life and they are a Christian company that support biblical values. They actually save lives through their company, and you can help save lives when you buy their coffee or even subscribe to their Heartbeat Club. When you drink coffee, you're going to help save lives because 7 Weeks Coffee donates 10% of every sale to pro-life pregnancy care centers, and this is upwards of 50% of their profit. So it's really simple. Drink coffee and save lives. And that's why I love 7 Weeks Coffee, but that's not the only reason. I also love 7 Weeks Coffee because it's just the best coffee I've ever had. You know, I used to do this subscription service from this artisan coffee roaster in Oregon. And I have to tell you, I'm not kidding, 7 Weeks is better than that. It is mold and toxin free. They practice organic farming practices. It's ultra low acid, and it's sourced through direct trade. So this is even more ethical than fair trade. And I love this too. 7 Weeks Coffee pays their farmers 300% more than fair trade coffee requires. I absolutely love this. And to date, they've given over $300,000 to these pro-life resource centers. So it's a no-brainer. Go to 7weekscoffee.com. Use my code Alisa for 10% off. Again, that's 7weekscoffee.com. Use my code Alisa. And how is this accepted in the broader scientific world? Is there a lot of pushback on it? Do people try to just portray you as this kind of wacky Christian thing, or how is this? I know you recently were on the Joe Rogan podcast, which was pretty cool, that exposed these ideas to a larger audience. But what's the general attitude in the scientific community?
Well, it's improving, but slowly. And we've had many cases going back to, I mean, the first books on intelligent design started to come out in the mid 90s. William Dembski's book, The Design Inference, which was published at Cambridge University Press, Michael Behe's book, Darwin's Black Box. Then I published Signature in the Cell in 2009. And there have been a number of key books and many scientific articles advancing the theory. In the 90s and early 2000s, there was a lot of pushback and a lot we like to say that we got canceled before getting canceled was cool. So in '04, I wrote an article for the a peer-reviewed journal that was published out of the Smithsonian Institution called The Proceedings of the Biological Society of Washington. And it was at the time, we think it was the first peer-reviewed article advancing the theory of intelligent design published in a mainstream journal. And one of the raps against intelligent design prior to that was there are no articles about intelligent design in peer-reviewed scientific journals. So then one was published, and then the argument shifted, and it was, well, it shouldn't be published in in a scientific journal because it's not science. So you had this kind of circular argument, the exclusionary argument. It's not science because it's not been published in a peer-reviewed scientific journal. It can't be science, so therefore it shouldn't be published in a peer-reviewed scientific journal. It was, it was
Right.
crazy making. But and we had the editor who published that, who was at the time not a proponent of intelligent design, but has since become one.
Oh, wow.
Um, Richard Sternberg was severely really persecuted by his colleagues after having done so. He, they couldn't really get at me. I was submitted the article from an independent research institute, but they immediately removed him from his role as the editor of the journal. He was uh, taken. He was locked out of his office and moved to an office near the administrators of the Smithsonian so they could keep an eye on him. Some people from um, attempted to get him fired at the National Institutes of Health, where he had a joint appointment, and there was a very emotional meeting at the society that oversaw the publication of the journal, and the president of the society told Richard Sternberg, who was then the editor, not to come to the meeting to discuss the controversy over his having published the article because he couldn't guarantee his personal safety. Tempers were
Wow.
running that high.
Wow.
So that was '04. One of our top scientists was expelled from a lab about the same time. In the, and After having done exemplary work and having just published or submitted a paper for publication that was eventually published at a major journal, the Journal for Molecular Biology. In 2016, 17, a leading paleontologist who curated the bicentennial exhibition uh, celebrating the work of Charles Darwin at the Stuttgart Museum of Natural History announced that he had become a supporter of the theory of intelligent design after a long kind of soul searching process. And he was asked to leave the museum, but because of European Union rules against religious discrimination, they weren't able to get rid of him. And he ended up negotiating a more favorable exit. But it was the he was being shunned in the hallways and wasn't allowed to work on exhibitions that he had created and things like that.
Wow.
So we've had a number of incidents where some very very top scientists have been subjected to viewpoint discrimination, cancellation, suppression of their views, and so forth. In fact, the way I came to the notice of the leaders at the Discovery Institute was an article I wrote, as I mentioned, in the Wall Street Journal in 1993, defending Dean Kenyon, a leading origin of life researcher who had early in his career been one of the chief proponents of what is known as chemical evolution, and later had repudiated that his own theory
Mm.
and ended up adopting an intelligent design viewpoint. So
Wow.
um, that was that I think from during the '90s and the first couple decades of the new century. But we've had a lot of that kind of pushback.
Hmm.
And I think a lot of younger scientists are still aware there's a fair deal of risk to their careers if they're too open about their sympathies for intelligent design. But I think the dams have broken, and there are
Mm.
more and more people adopting this perspective, especially younger scientists, and many of them are getting through to tenure. And so I think this is shifting, and we're very bullish. There's as I mentioned, over 1,000 scientists in our larger network, and that's growing all the time. And a lot of the energy in around this debate about biological origins, I think, was with our side. The younger scientists are I think very intrigued with this new position.
Hmm.
When you see things, and when you're studying something like basic molecular or cell biology, and you encounter the exquisite, not just information in DNA, but this exquisite information storage, transmission, and processing system. And you see all the processes that are taking place, the exquisitely finely tuned processes that exhibit engineering control and feedback loops um, and the processing of information by reference to uh, design strategies and processes, what are called design patterns that are used in advanced computer science. And you're seeing all this at work in the cell. It's really hard not to think, this looks like it was an engineered system. This looks
Yeah.
designed. And just putting the words intelligent design out there have brought a lot of younger scientists our way because they end up studying molecular and cell biology and they see these processes at work. And the thing that most naturally occurs to them is this was engineered, this was intelligently designed. So they're associating the word that's in circulation with the processes they're seeing. And
Mm.
on my website, I have a new website for the new book, Return to the God Hypothesis. And we have a playlist of animations of these miniature machines and the process by which information is or the information processing system in the cell. And just for people that are curious, go on and look at some of those things. It's pretty awesome. And
Yeah.
it's not in Darwin's day, they thought the cell was a simple homogeneous globule of undifferentiated protoplasm. That was a quote from his promotion, his chief promoter, Thomas Henry Huxley. And that's not what the cell is today. I mean,
Yeah.
we know the cell is not a blob of protoplasm.
Right. I've seen some of those videos, and they're just truly astounding to see how complicated, how complex, and just how it all works together is fascinating. I'd love to talk a little bit about evolution because, there's a sense in which you think about how different breeds of dogs are created even through breeding. And you can, the famous example is the woolly sheep in the coldest climates. The ones that aren't as woolly die off. So the woolliest sheep mate with one another and create woollier sheep, right? So that's change over time. That's in a sense in which people might use the word evolution for that. But what is the definition of evolution as far as what we might talk about in this context, and how does that interact with the science of intelligent design?
That is a fantastic question, Alyssa, and it's where a lot of the confusion comes in because the word evolution can mean many different things, and you can provide um, evidence in support of evolution in one sense that's very strong that doesn't actually support evolution in some other sense. So there's a fallacy of equivocation. So three key different ways of defining evolution. The first is change over time. Do biological systems change over time? Yes, they do, no question. Um, and there's different ways in which we could even define change over time. We could think of the change that occurs with things like a population of sheep responding to changes in the environment, or Darwin's famous finches that where the beaks got a little longer, a little shorter, changed shape a little bit this way and that in response to varying weather patterns and what they had available to eat. If there was only the really hard shelled nuts, then the finches with the longer beaks survived more than the ones with the shorter beaks. So that you have this type of modest change within the limits of a pre-existing gene pool. Is what it turns out to be. And sometimes that's called microevolution. You also have change over time in the sense that the the living forms that are on the planet today are not identical to the forms of life that lived during the Jurassic or the Cretaceous period. As much as I lament it, we do not have any dinosaurs running around today, which was and so the forms of life, we don't have trilobites such as existed in the Cambrian period. So there are many the representation of life forms on the planet is different now than it was a long time ago. That's also a form of change over time. Nobody disputes that meaning of evolution. A second meaning of evolution is the idea that the change that has occurred on planet Earth in living forms has been gradual and continuous, such that the picture of life that we see is best represented by a kind of branching tree picture. And this was one of the ways that Darwin depicted how he envisioned the evolutionary process. So you start with one or very few simple forms, a simple one celled organism. It gradually becomes more and more complex, it becomes a multicellular organism. And then those organisms evolve and morph and change and eventually have all the forms of life we see today, but they've arisen through a slow, gradual process, and and such that all the forms of life today are related by common ancestry, going back to that very first simple form or forms. And that's sometimes called the theory of universal common descent or universal common ancestry. So you've got change, that's one meaning, but then you have the idea of continuous change such that the picture of the history of life is best represented as a branching tree. Now, that meaning is, let's get to the third meaning. The third meaning then is the idea that the process that has produced that continuous change is completely unguided and undirected, such that the appearance of design that we see in living organisms is an illusion. It's just an appearance because an unguided process, natural selection acting on random variations and mutations, produce that little bit by bit gradual change over long periods of time. And that explains all the new form that's arisen in the history of life and the appearance of design that those new forms exhibit. So the theory of intelligent design is challenging that third meaning of evolution. Many of us are skeptical about the second meaning of evolution as well, the idea of universal common ancestry. We see evidence of dramatic discontinuity in the fossil record and dramatic discontinuity in the genomic um, record. The genes of different organisms are much more disparate than we thought even 20 years ago. There's something called orphan genes, a fantastic new discovery that suggests discontinuity at both the genetic and at the fossil level. So that would challenge the idea of universal common descent. But that's not our principal, the principal thing that we are challenging. We are challenging the idea that there's a purely unguided, undirected mechanism that can produce all the new forms of life we see and the appearance of design that they manifest. And so that is, in a sense, where you can contrast the idea of apparent design produced by natural selection, the unguided process of natural selection, with the idea of intelligent design. That's where the real argument is taking place, and where we are developing, I think, uh, very powerful arguments for intelligent design, and showing that the appearance of design in nature is in many, many cases demonstrably real. It's the product of intelligence, not an undirected process.
You brought up the fossil record, and I would love for you to expound on that a little bit. You have a chapter in The Return of the God Hypothesis about the Cambrian explosion of information. Talk a little bit about what we've learned from the fossil record, even since Darwin's theory first came into popular consciousness.
Right. I mean, that's a fascinating topic by itself. I've written three big books. One is Signature in the Cell, which was about the origin of the first life, that first simple cell, and the information needed to produce it. My second book was about an event in the history of life known as the Cambrian explosion, and also looking at both the gaps in the fossil record, the abrupt appearance of this array of animals in the Cambrian period, which is now called an explosion by most paleontologists, and the information needed to build those new animals. And that book was called Darwin's Doubt, The Explosive Origin of Animal Life and the Case for Intelligent Design. And then I reprised that argument in brief in my most recent book called The Return of the God Hypothesis, which not only looked at the evidence of design in biology, but also evidence of design in cosmology and physics that enable us to decide whether the design we're seeing is the product of, say, an immanent intelligence somewhere in the cosmos, like a space alien, or a transcendent designer who has the attributes of God. And I argue for the God hypothesis. In any case, the fossil record, the oftentimes one of Darwin's key arguments in The Origin of Species was an argument known as fossil progression, and it was the observation that over time the organisms that are introduced into the fossil record seem to be getting, roughly speaking, more and more complex. We now know that that's not an absolute rule, but it is still a general rule. And that suggests a kind of evolution in the sense of change over time. There are forms of life today that are living on the planet that were not present in previous periods of geological history. So there has been change over time, evolution in that sense. But the fossil record does not attest to continuous and or continuous and gradual change. Instead, what we see is the abrupt appearance of major new form in the history of life, that biological innovation occurs abruptly. And one of the most dramatic examples of that is the Cambrian explosion. In events such as the Cambrian explosion, you see this abrupt appearance of major new forms of animal life, or later periods, plant life. But when you look at the strata just beneath the strata where these new forms appear, you don't find, the paleontologists have not found ancestral forms, ancestral precursors or intermediates that suggest a gradual transition or morphing from one form of life to another. Instead, you just see this abrupt appearance. And in Darwin's time, he called it saltation. And he understood that it was a problem, it was a challenge to his theory, but he assumed that the gaps or the discontinuities in the fossil record would eventually be filled in by further discoveries. Instead, what's happened is that the discontinuity, the discontinuous picture of the history of life has become even more dramatic as we've made more fossil finds. In the Cambrian period, Darwin knew of a handful of organisms that first arose during that period, trilobites and brachiopods and a few others. But in our time, we now know of many, many other forms of life that also abruptly rose in the Cambrian period, for which there are also no ancestral precursors or intermediates. So the Cambrian explosion, from our point of view, has gotten more explosive, not less, in the 160 years since the time that Darwin wrote The Origin. And in a follow-up publication to Darwin's Doubt, with Gunter Beckley, the paleontologist that I mentioned a bit ago, who had this intellectual conversion to intelligent design, I co-authored with Gunter an article about other major fossil explosions. And we identified 19 major abrupt appearance events in the history of life.
Wow.
Not just the first animals in the Cambrian, but the first turtles, the first fishes, the first reptiles, the first flowering plants, the first mammals. As you go up and down the rock column, you find multiple events, multiple abrupt appearance events. So this is the pattern, the arching pattern of the fossil record. It's the rule, not the exception. And this is very non-Darwinian.
Mm.
So much so that some of the leading evolutionists in the late 1970s and 80s, Stephen Jay Gould and Niles Eldredge, developed a theory they called punctuated equilibrium in order to try to more accurately describe the pattern in the fossil record. And in the 1980s, Gould was quoted as saying that neo-Darwinism, the modern version of Darwin's theory, was effectively dead except as textbook orthodoxy. And
Wow.
I think that's even more true today, as many evolutionary biologists themselves are calling for a new theory of evolution, primarily because they recognize that the natural selection random mutation mechanism lacks the creative power to generate major innovation in the history of life. It does a
Mm.
nice job of explaining small scale variations like the peppered moths and the woolly sheep, but it doesn't do a good job of explaining where birds and mammals and animals came from in the first place.
Wow. Well, this is so fascinating. We're about out of time. What else would you love for our audience to know? I know your recent book is called Return of the God Hypothesis. Give us a nutshell view of what you'd want to leave everybody with as far as how to think about all of these topics of how science and faith relate together. Um, give us some parting words of wisdom here.
Well, sure. Well, I don't know how wise it will be, but I'll give you some parting words anyway. I think many people of faith, Christians in particular, have felt that science is in some way an adversary to their beliefs.
Mm.
There has been since the late 19th century something called the conflict model, the idea that science and religious belief generally, and Christian belief, biblical convictions, are at odds, that they are in conflict. There were books published in the late 19th century with titles like The History of the Warfare Between Science and Christianity. And that revisionist history of the relationship between science and faith. And I say it is revisionist because Christianity actually gave rise to modern science. It was a huge influence in the formation of modern science during the 16th and 17th century when modern science got going. But that revisionist history from the late 19th century sort of colored the view that we've all had of the relationship between science and faith since then. And Christians, I think, particularly those who have gone into the sciences, have felt on the defensive. And so another model of the relationship between science and faith arose, and it's sometimes called compartmentalism or independence or complementarity. And it's the idea that, well, science hasn't disproven the existence of God or disproven the biblical witness, but it doesn't say anything in support of it either. That science and faith are in two different realms. There's the realm of faith and values and morality, and then there's the realm of facts. It's the old fact value distinction.
Mm-hmm.
And so under that scheme, Christians are feeling slightly less defensive, but they've confined their belief system to the realm of the abstract. It has no bearing on the facts of the world. So one view, the conflict view, says the facts contradict the faith. The other view says facts and faith are in separate compartments. Ne'er the twain shall meet. But increasingly, what's happening is that there are discoveries that are actually supportive of a theistic worldview.
Mm-hmm.
The discovery that the universe had a beginning, the material universe itself, apparently, as best we can tell, came into existence a finite time ago. This is the so-called Big Bang theory, which many people of faith have thought was challenging faith, but in fact, it's pointing to the need for an external creator or an external cause to account for the origin of the
Yeah.
physical universe. The discovery of digital code and the software inside the cell, that's pointing to the need of for an intelligent designer. The fine tuning of the physical parameters of the universe that many physicists themselves are now saying points to the need for some sort of fine tuner, a transcendent fine tuner. So you have these discoveries in multiple fields of science that seem to require the need for an intelligent cause or even a transcendent intelligence to explain. And this is the thesis that I put forward in my most recent book, Return of the God Hypothesis, where I don't just argue for an intelligent designer of some unspecified kind, but actually one that has the attributes that Jews and Christians have long ascribed to God. Transcendence, in other words, a creator who's separate from the universe, who can bring the whole of the creation or cause the whole of creation to come into existence, and then one who is active in designing the creation to produce all the forms of life we see around us. And that's what I think the evidence shows. So rather than feeling defensive or feeling like science undermines belief, I think now is the time to have a renewed intellectual confidence in the belief system that we find in the Bible, in the Judeo-Christian faith tradition, that there is a God, that God is transcendent, above and beyond creation, the creator of all things, but also a God who has acted in the creation, not a deistic creation, but creator, but one who is active. And so I think we should feel very confident that there is an intellectual basis, a scientific basis for our faith, and that we needn't have that insecurity that many, I think, people of faith have been carrying with them since the late
Yeah.
19th century.
Yes, well, those were wise words indeed. I want to thank my guest, Dr. Stephen Meyer. Please get his books. If you have friends who are skeptical about faith and science, or if this is a topic you are struggling with, like what is the relationship with spirituality, with Christianity, and with scientific evidence that we find, please pick up these books. There's Signature in the Cell, DNA and the Evidence for Intelligent Design, Darwin's Doubt, The Explosive Origin of Animal Life and the Case for Intelligent Design, and then Dr. Meyer's most recent book, Return of the God Hypothesis, 3 scientific discoveries that reveal the mind behind the universe. I think you're going to find yourself very equipped, and these will really help strengthen your confidence in the Christian worldview as it would relate to scientific evidence that's applied to it to show us the truthfulness of reality. So I want to, again, thank Dr. Meyer for coming on. And if you're watching this on YouTube, please subscribe and click the bell icon to be notified every time we release a new video. It also helps if you're listening on audio platforms like Google, Apple, Spotify. If you leave good reviews, that really helps that algorithm. If you see this go by on a social media post, click like, leave a little comment. All of that helps get the word out to more people. And as we pursue Christ, let's remember to keep a sharp mind, a soft heart, and a thick skin. We'll see you next time.
So pray.